Right, welcome, KNES 310. I hope you guys are doing well. Today we're going to talk about the trunk and how the trunk moves independently and then how it works with the pelvis, as I gave you a heads up last lecture. Okay, so remember the trunk is defined. Remember, I need to tell you, my bad. But you have different vertebrae, right? You have the skyscraper. Every vertebra is like a floor of a skyscraper, and up top you have 7 cervical. Those are really smaller, so therefore they're more movable. The smaller they are, the more they can move. The denser they are, that means the more they got to hold up, and we trade off mobility for stability. So once you get into ribs, once you start having ribs, that's what we call thoracic. Cool. And then when you run out of ribs, that's what we call lumbar. So the trunk, as I'm defining it in class, is the sum total motions of the thoracic and the lumbar, because I can move my cervical independently, but when I start to move my thorax, it's a combination of these guys, with these guys providing the most and the lumbar providing the least, obviously, because look how dense these guys are, right? They got to support all that stuff on top. And yeah, the vertebrae have other functions, protection, and they allow a network of nerves and arteries and stuff, but this is a human movement class, so we're looking at in terms of the motion capabilities. So remember, whew, deep breath, Brian. So much information, but this is fun stuff. And if you like human movement and kinesiology, you're going to like this stuff. So individual movements between vertebrae are insignificant. Amphiarthrotic, if you remember from that lecture. Amphiarthrotic because of cartilage in the front, amphiarthrotic because of ligament in the back. But if you summate all of them, then you get significant motion. You can bend side to side, you can flex and extend front and back, then you could twist left and right in the transverse, okay? So that's what we're getting to. We're talking about the sum total of all these little bits and get significant motion, okay? So this is the sum total of all of the vertebrae, okay? In terms of the trunk. The trunk is going to be on your next test, and the cervical is going to be put with the upper extremity. Okay, so let me set this guy down and give you a kind of a general. So here's the pelvis, and here's the trunk. And what I'm going to show you to start off with is, hey, trunk, bend to your right in the frontal plane. It's going to look like this. Hey, trunk, bend to your left in the frontal plane. It's going to look like that. Hey, trunk, flex is going to look like this. Hey, trunk, extend. Obviously, I have a super high pelvis with this box, but I wanted to show you on the camera, okay? So maybe I can do something like this, okay? So that way you can follow me more, okay? Hey, trunk, flex, bend. See how it bends forward, gets you more in the fetal. Hey, trunk, extend. Now, all of this is trunk bending about a fixed pelvis, so we don't have to worry about pelvic girdle rotations. Okay, trunk flex, trunk extend. Hey, trunk bend to your right. We call that right lateral trunk bending. Hey, trunk bend to your left, left lateral trunk bending. So, how do I communicate right lateral from left lateral in terms of where am I in the range of motion? Super simple. Right lateral trunk bending from anatomical, left lateral trunk bending to anatomical, left lateral trunk bending from anatomical. Right lateral trunk bending to anatomical, right lateral trunk bending from anatomical. We talked about that in the first test, right? From home, to home, away from, towards. Right lateral from, left lateral to, left lateral from, right lateral to. Trunk flexion from, trunk extension to, trunk extension from, trunk flexion to. Super simple, okay? Now, right and left means two different things in two different planes. I've talked to you about this before. Doing a cartwheel to your right or doing a cartwheel to your left is kind of frontal plane to your right and to your left. Look to your right, look to your left is transverse plane right and left. So it's the same thing with the trunk, okay? Right lateral is a frontal plane communication of motion and position. Left lateral to the side. Do a cartwheel to your right side, to your left side. Right transverse is twist your trunk to the right. Left transverse is twist your trunk to the left. Again, making sure that that twisting is happening trunk to pelvis. Hard to see twisty stuff with this. So, but again, there's clues in the clothing. So the arthrodial concept of the sum total of all those little bits can move significantly in all three of our planes. Sagittal for flexion extension, it follows all of our flexion extension concepts. Bending to my right, bending to my left, right lateral trunk bending, left lateral trunk bending. Some people still refer to that as lateral flexion. Potato, cat menu. The term bending became more popular because, again, flexion and extension is kind of reserved for sagittal plane. So that's why a lot of clinicians kind of got more into lateral bending versus lateral flexion. But there, you may hear that. So I wanted to introduce that to you guys. And then the other motions of just the trunk moving about the pelvis, right transverse trunk rotation, left transverse trunk rotation. Now, flexion, extension, right lateral trunk bending, left lateral trunk bending, right transverse trunk rotation, left transverse, apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Why does one get the R word, rotation, where the others don't? The pelvis got all R words. It's because from the pelvis perspective, it's always spinning about its center of mass. It's like a basketball spinning, right? But for the trunk, there's a lot of general motion. When you flex and extend, right? When I flex my trunk, I'm moving mass forward and down, up and back, over to my right side. But when I spin in my transverse plane, that's more like spinning a basketball, okay? So that's why transverse gets the R word, because it's more pure of a rotation as opposed to general motion, okay? So what I have here is, and obviously I'm going to work into these with real world, I'm going to get up and move around, but I wanted to give you a visual. And pause this if you need, take a picture of it if this helps you. This is trying to help you see how the trunk moves traditionally, and then how the trunk moves functionally for our functional circle of reach, sight, or balance. I might add functional circle of balance. That's kind of a cool word. First, I'm not a very good artist. I got that. I've been knowing that since I was in kindergarten, probably before kindergarten. Legs, pelvis, trunk, and then this T represents your shoulder level, like literally imagine like your collarbones, okay? So if you see it tilted like this, that means your shoulders are tilted, okay? So remember, we like to keep our shoulders level, and when we can't have our shoulders level, I'm going to show you how the neck can kind of bend back to at least keep our eyes level. But it's easier for us to work if our upper extremity is level. Harder to work right here. We could still make it happen, but it's really, really hard to process data with our eyes at an angle globally. So we're always going to try to be level to the ground so that we could process data. We don't fall over. So legs, pelvis, trunk, shoulders. Okay. This, if this is staring at you, right? I go from here to there. And look, the pelvis, I keep forgetting that I'm tethered. The pelvis didn't spin. All I did was bend the trunk to my left. If I'm facing you and I went from here to there, that's left lateral trunk bending. Okay, so you can make a note of that. From here to there, left lateral trunk bending, bending to the left. Now remember, these initial joint motions are from the usually lesser massive thing moving about the more massive thing. Again, doors, we called the door's motion relative to the door being smaller than the wall. So the trunk here is kind of the movable part, and our pelvis and all of our lower extremities, kind of the anchor part. Smaller part moving about the bigger part. I know that's debatable, but the concept is movable distal against immovable proximal. Left lateral trunk bending. Right lateral trunk bending. Bend to the right. Okay, now dip, baby, dip. Now let's look at how these bends might look different, illusions, but they're the same bend. And I'm going to try to help you out by using our very super expensive prop here. What if the intention was to put more weight on my right leg, to kind of take some weight off of my left? You know, you shift your weight from side to side. And so you put more weight on your right, you bend your left, so that way the pelvis can drop down. You have left lateral pelvic girdle rotation when you do that. Looks like this, left lateral. Notice the little arrow showing you how the pelvis is rotating. And we say, did the pelvis rotate? Yes, okay, great. What spun it? Pelvis can't spin by itself. There has to be some joint motions responsible for the spin. Now, the trunk wasn't responsible for the spin. In other words, if I'm standing on my feet and I say, hey, trunk, spin my pelvis, my trunk is going to do all this stuff because my upper body's free to move. And my pelvis is like, dude, I'm not going anywhere until my hips make me move. So right hip adduction, left hip abduction were responsible for the left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Now, here is what the trunk can do. Imagine you are a waiter and you're trying to balance drinks as you walk to your table. And as you know, sometimes things may, you got to shift, you got to dodge little kids running at you. And even though your whole body may move one way, you need to cancel out that motion to make sure your hand stays level. So if there's a reason, which usually there is, to keep your shoulders level, as the pelvis wants to spin to its left laterally, you need to have something happen at your trunk, or all of this stuff is going to go along for the ride. The dotted lines represent the trunk staying in its anatomical position. So the trunk is going to bend back to its right. You don't perceive it because as you do this, this stayed still. So you don't perceive the trunk rotating with the pelvis back to the other side because you don't process it globally. What's one way to look at that? One way to look at that is if I'm walking here, let's say I want to keep my fingers in the same position, okay? If I'm walking across, I can move my wrist at the same speed as my body to keep my fingers in the same place. But notice, my wrist is extended when I started, and now my wrist is flexed as I finished. So if my wrist rotation happens at the same speed as my other body's movements, then it can keep a segment in the same place. It's canceling out motion, also creates an illusion. So the point is that my trunk bends back to its right. If you're having a tough time seeing this, tilt your head. Press pause if you need to, but tilt your head, right ear, right shoulder. Look at the pelvis. Remember, the pelvis is never lost. The pelvis is always in its anatomical position. Look at the pelvis neutrally and notice how the trunk is bent just like this is bent. Pelvis spins to the left, trunk bends back, recurves back to the right. They cancel out each other's rotation to keep the shoulders level. So if I go to shift weight on my right leg, you don't even notice it up here. If I shift weight on my left leg, you don't notice it up here. Because motion that's happening at the pelvis is canceled out by motion that's happening at the trunk. I'll do that again. If I start here and I shift my weight on my right leg, I have left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Notice how my hand up here doesn't seem to move. That's because my trunk bent back the other way. Start, finish. What if I froze my trunk? Freeze ray. And I bring everything back to anatomical position except for my trunk. I had right lateral trunk bending. Okay? It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. It's a feature that our bodies do in order to cancel out rotations that might take our shoulders and our eyes out of level position. Okay? Now, does the trunk have to always cancel with the pelvis? No. Sometimes they can actually spin in the same direction, but that's usually a very functional task of trying to like reach down. So like, look, I have an example. Let's say in this case, my trunk bent in the same direction as my pelvis. Left lateral pelvic, left lateral trunk, it's going to help me reach down, like maybe to grab a bucket or grab something off of the ground and then bring it back up. So I have this example, how the pelvis, when the pelvis and the trunk spin in the same direction, look at the position it puts your shoulders in. You could reach down and grab something. Okay. Or if you were playing ball, right? If you're trying to reach down to make a play down here, you'd want your pelvis and your trunk to both rotate in the same direction, to summate motion, not cancel out motion. This is canceling out for functional circles, and this is summation. Trying to use those two together to grab something, play defense, swat a ball, pick up your dog, whatever. Okay? So we're good? All right. Now again, I'm going to get to, while I'm tethered and while I have this up, I'm going to try to get to frontal and sagittal, and then I'm going to spin the computer around, and then I'm going to do a bunch of examples for you guys, okay? So what that means is that maybe you want to rewatch this first part a few times, and then when I get into the examples, it may make more sense, okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the headphones off, and then I'm just going to do some simple play on here to switch it into the sagittal plane. Because if you think about it, if we're looking at frontal plane bending, we want to look in the front. If we're going to look at sagittal plane bending, like flexion extension, we want to look at the side to really see it, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away two legs and I'm going to put one leg, okay, just to emphasize, and then I'm going to kind of narrow these shoulders, because now you're not looking at my shoulders like this, you're looking at my shoulders like this. And I'm probably going to add a head in there just so that, to make sure you understand that now we're looking this way or that way, okay? All right, this shouldn't take long. What lovely artwork, right? I mean, Picasso had some like weird drawings that made millions of dollars, man. Maybe my weird drawings will be worth something one day. Let's look at traditional free movement of the trunk. It looks like it's moving, and it is. That kind of stuff, all right? From anatomical, and yes, I know that the trunk has a curve. I know. I'm just trying to use this as a teaching tool to kind of show you the bend, okay? Anatomical to here, trunk flexion. Aren't I in more of a fetal position, right? You think about sleeping or curling up into a ball, you want to get into a flexed position. Trunk flexion from anatomical, trunk extension to anatomical, trunk extension from anatomical, trunk flexion to anatomical, trunk flexion from anatomical, trunk extension to trunk extension, okay? Now, the illusions. The illusions. First of all, that's just bad. That looks like some kind of extinct dodo bird. I apologize for that. But what would happen if the pelvis and the trunk spun in the same direction? And the answer is you'll be able to tie your shoes. You'll be able to get your keys. Guys, the trunk doesn't really contribute a ton. I mean, because again, it's bending. It's little parts of a lot of. This is now. I'm a little bit more stiff than maybe some of you guys. Watch the contribution of just my trunk. I'm going to try to get my keys down at the floor. Hey, trunk, get my hands down so I can grab my keys. Sure, Brian. Flexion. Ugh. And then I'm done. I feel like a T-Rex. That shows you how much contribution is anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of hip flexion. It's a huge contribution. But even though my pelvis can rotate anteriorly, flexing my trunk helps to get my upper extremity down even more. Summation of motion. They're working together at the same spin to help get my hands down to do things. Tie my shoes, pick something up, right? Whatever I need to do down there, anterior pelvic girdle rotation, because of hip flexion, summated with trunk flexion, can help get my upper extremity closer to the floor for me to do things. Here's the illusion. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. If I anteriorly pelvic girdle rotate, but I want to keep my shoulders level, anterior pelvic girdle rotation to keep my shoulders level. Now, why would someone just anteriorly pelvic girdle rotate? Maybe they have real tight back muscles. Maybe they were trying to emphasize that sway back to get that booty to pop out. Just saying. If you're anteriorly tilted, it's going to make your butt poke out the back. So some people have this natural posture of being anteriorly pelvic girdle rotated. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it is. There's some people who are constantly pouring water out the front. That's their position. What I'm trying to show you is that if someone's anteriorly tilted, they are naturally flexed. Their hip flexors are in a sling. They're in a constant state of fetal position from their hips. That's going to lead to their hips being super tight. In addition, their trunk is going to be constantly extended, because if it wasn't, look, they would constantly be walking around like this. If you're anteriorly tilted, if you're anteriorly tilted and you don't do anything to your trunk is going to go along for the ride. So how do you correct it to keep your shoulders level? You extend. Bring the pelvis back to anatomical position and see how you are extended. Let me do it in the same direction here so that it doesn't confuse you. Anterior pelvic girdle rotation. And if I want to keep my shoulders level, I have to have extension. From here to there, extension. Bring the pelvis back to anatomical. Notice how I'm in extended position relative to anatomical. Got it? Okay. Can you go the other way? Absolutely. Absolutely. You can be posteriorly pelvic girdle rotated. See if I could draw it for you guys. This is super extreme. But if you are posteriorly pelvic girdle rotated, that means your trunk needs to now be flexed to keep your body level. Because if it wasn't, your trunk would be out over here. So you're going to flex, okay? And your hips are going to be extended. Anatomical position, extended. Okay? All right. So that is the basics of trunk motion in the sagittal and frontal plane. Friday's lecture, we're going to get into the transverse. So just the two first ones today. And what I'm going to give you, I'm going to turn the camera around, and we're going to do a lot of examples. And I'm going to try to use the skeleton, and I'm going to try to use my little box and pool noodle. And I'm just going to do a lot of examples. And if you get it, dude, awesome. If you don't get it, rewatch the video. And if you don't get it, rewatch the video. And if you still don't get it, text me and we'll find a time to FaceTime where I can maybe clarify, or if you have any specific questions, okay? All right, we could do this. All right, let me turn this around and we'll get into some practice. guys, so for a reminder, pelvis, trunk. If I have right lateral pelvic girdle rotation and I don't want my upper body to pour water out the right side, maybe I want to keep my shoulders level so that I can keep working on a counter or on a level surface, I need to bend my trunk back to its left. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation, I need to bend my trunk back to the left. Okay? That skeleton's super stiff, so let me use my prop. Pelvic girdle spins to the right laterally. I need to bend my trunk to the left to cancel it out. Start, finish. If you're having a tough time seeing it, tilt your right ear to your right shoulder and look at how the trunk went from here to there. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation, left lateral trunk bending. Now, the left lateral trunk bending didn't spin my pelvis. The hips spun my pelvis because my hips are anchored to the ground through my feet. So what did the trunk do? The trunk rotated to keep my upper extremity. It canceled out what the pelvis was trying to do to all of my upper body. Meaning that when my pelvis did this, everything attached to it also wanted to go in that same direction. So my trunk bends back the other way to keep my shoulders and my eyes level. Okay? And again, it's subtle. You may not see it, but look at the clothes. Look at the bend to the clothes. Look at how my clothes bend. It kind of shows you the bend that happened. Okay? So, how would this look like in terms of pelvic girdle motion? Who was responsible for the spin, and then what did the trunk do to cancel? Both standing on both legs, right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. What spun the pelvis? My right hip abducting and my left hip adducting. What did the trunk do? The trunk bent back to the left to keep my upper extremity level so that I could keep working, typing. You know, my feet are getting tired, so I'm going to shift my weight on my right leg. Pelvis spun to the left laterally because of my left hip ab and my right hip ad. But if that would have happened and I didn't bend my trunk, all of a sudden I'd be here. So my trunk is going to bend back to the right so that I can keep working. Then I'm going to get tired on my right leg. I'm going to do this. Pelvis spins to the right laterally because of left hip ad, right hip ab. My trunk then is going to bend back to the left laterally, and so on. Okay? This is important for gait, for walking too. Right? I kind of hit it on that. When you're walking and you take a step and your pelvis is going to fluctuate between right lateral, because you got to hike that left leg up so that when you swing your leg through, obviously I'm super exaggerating it, but you don't want to catch your foot on the floor. So when you go from heel strike to foot flat, you're going to have to right lateral pelvic girdle rotate just a little bit to help get this side up because you're pulling the right side down. The hip motion is right hip abduction. The pelvic girdle rotation is right lateral. And the trunk, because again, if your trunk went along for the ride, you'd do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. And again, it's subtle. But when you do this and you have right lateral, your trunk is going to cancel out the motion of the pelvis by bending back to the right. If my pelvis is trying to take everything on top of it to its right, I got to bend back to the left. Sorry, I'm going to bend back to the left. The pelvis is going to spin to the right. Pelvis is trying to pour, because think about it. Think of it as the pelvis has water to pour, but your shoulders have water to pour. And if the pelvis is going to pour water out the right, and I don't want to pour water out the right on my shoulders, I got to bend back the other way, just like a waiter. If their body is going to take the glass over this way, they have to compensate by bending back the other way to keep it level. It's no different. No different. So, right lateral pelvic girdle rotation, when my feet are on the ground. What caused the pelvic girdle rotation? Hip motion. What canceled out pelvic girdle rotation to keep me level? Trunk motion. And again, my trunk can bend the same way as the pelvis, but what that would look like is this. If I'm trying to grab or move or get something down here. In other words, when I don't need my shoulders to be level, when I need them to bend over, pour water out the right side to grab something, catch something. Okay? Let's look at sagittal plane. First start with this. See if I can do this. See if it may not even bend. Posterior, anterior. Now this is way too stiff. Okay? Anterior, obviously I'm exaggerating. Anterior, if I bring my pelvis back to anatomical and my hips, but I don't bring my trunk back, watch what it's going to look like. I'm extended my trunk. Anterior pelvic girdle rotation because of trunk extension, keeping my shoulders balanced. Okay? Now, what was responsible for the anterior? My hips. What did my hips do when I have anterior pelvic girdle rotation? It's because of hip flexion. Okay? I'm flexed. Hip flexion caused it. And my trunk extension prevented that hip flexion from bringing my upper body along for the ride. If I anteriorly pelvic girdle rotate and I don't extend, my center of mass is going to start to tip over my base of support. I may fall over. Kind of gets to functional circle of balance, keeping your stuff over your feet. If I don't counter by bending back, if I do this, now my stuff is going to pass over my feet. Anterior pelvic girdle rotation, because of hip flexion, my trunk curves back the other way in a direction of extension to keep my shoulders level, thus keeping my center of mass over my base of support, keeping my balance. Posterior pelvic girdle rotation is going to be because of trunk flexion. Notice how my trunk is flexed relative to anatomical position. Posterior pelvic girdle rotation. Posterior pelvic girdle rotation. Okay? Anterior trunk hip flexion. Posterior because of hip extension. My trunk is a great, like you think about shocks on a car where like suspension on a car, right? So in other words, even though the car may be hitting bumps, imperfections, slopes, slants, especially in Louisiana, right? Your car has a way of canceling out those motions to keep you level. Our bodies have the same thing. We learn to cancel out things, stuff that might take our pelvis to tilt us over, so that we don't tilt our whole body over, we're going to bend back the other way. Now, just like a bullfighter, right? If a bullfighter, if the bull is trying to lean his whole body this way, he's going to bend back the other way. And if the bullfighter is if the bull's trying to take the bullfighter that way, she may bend back the other way. Same thing. I'm just teaching you right now trunk's contribution to cancel out motion, and then eventually we're going to get to the cervical, and the cervical isn't to cancel out shoulder stuff because the cervical is above the shoulder stuff, but the cervical is going to be very important when I'm trying to keep my eyes on something. Right? I'm trying to keep my eyes level and look at something. and my body may need to reposition so that I can run the other way, but I want to keep my eyes on something. So functional circle of sight is really important for the neck. Okay, all right? So, again, review, frontal plane, right lateral trunk bending, left lateral trunk bending, trunk flexion, trunk extension, trunk flexion, trunk extension. Let's get to illusions. That was, it looks like it's moving and it is. Right lateral, left lateral, trunk flexion, trunk extension. Looks like it's moving and it is. These next ones are, it looks like it's moving but it's not. Now, my hips are moving, but my trunk stays in its anatomical position, and you can really see how when I have right lateral and the trunk doesn't recurve, the trunk doesn't go back, I'm going along for the ride. Everything on top of that pelvis is pouring water out the right side. To someone who's not trained correctly in human movement, you may fall for the trap of saying, oh, the trunk is bending to the right. That's a globally referenced mistake, because we know trunk motion is relative. It's not global. It's relative to this and this. Okay? Oh, look, my trunk is going forward. I must be flexing. No, not if everything is going forward or everything is going back. So, it looks like it's moving and it is. I don't know why my joint motions sound like Howard the Duck. It looks like it's moving and it's not. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Now, the fourth one is, it looks like it's not moving and it's not. That's the easy one, right? There's no reason for me to just stand there. So really, that's three things. Looks like it's moving and it is. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Okay? So I got 10 more minutes with you to practice. I'm going to lower the camera so that you can see my feet more this time, so that we can practice hip motion responsible for the spin, and then we can look at the recurve of the trunk to cancel. Ready? Okay. Sorry. Pelvic girdle rotation. Yes or no? If yes, then how? Start, finish. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation. What was responsible for the right lateral pelvic girdle rotation? Press pause. Answer. Welcome back. Left hip adduction, right hip abduction. Outstanding. Did the trunk bend in any way to cancel out, to keep my upper extremity level? Yes. How did it bend? It bent to my left. So guys, in summary, look at how much stuff happened by me just doing this. Just a simple rotation of my pelvis. All of this stuff happened. From here to there. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation, right hip abduction, left lateral trunk bending. From here to there. Left hip abduction, right hip adduction, left lateral pelvic girdle rotation, right lateral trunk bending. I might try to confuse you and do something like this, keeping my trunk in its anatomical, going along for the ride. Maybe some of you are like, oh, it looks like it's moving, and it is. Left lateral pelvic girdle rotation, left hip ab, right hip ad, trunk still in its anatomical because I didn't recurve back to the right to keep my shoulders level. Can the pelvis and the trunk rotate in the same direction? Absolutely. If my pelvis spins to its right and my trunk bends to my right, then my shoulders are going to really not be level. If they rotate in the same direction, there's no canceling out, there's summation, and your hand's going to get really low. Sometimes you need to get your hands low. Let's try it with one leg. My left leg's off the ground. That means whatever hip motion happens at my left leg, it was not responsible for pelvic girdle rotation. Think about it. If I'm balancing on my right leg, hey, left hip flex, no problem. My pelvis doesn't have to go anywhere. Hey, left hip abduct, no problem. My pelvis doesn't have to go anywhere. The only way my pelvis is going to go somewhere if my right leg is on the ground is if my right hip is responsible for that motion because it's anchored on the ground. My left hip's going to go along for the ride. Okay? So if I do something like this, if I have right lateral pelvic girdle rotation and I'm just standing on my right leg, we have the same things happening except now my left hip wasn't responsible for it. My left hip didn't contribute. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of right hip abduction, and my shoulder my trunk left lateral trunk bending to cancel out. As my pelvis spins to its right, my trunk compensates by bending to its left. Let's try another one. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip adduction. My right hip went along for the ride. My trunk, if it didn't do anything, would do this. It would go along with the tilt. But it didn't because I bent my trunk back to its left. So again, something simple like this really has a lot of different components. Pelvis, right lateral, left hip adduction, trunk, left lateral trunk bending from here to there. What you think? Pretty cool stuff, huh? I think it's pretty cool. Practice, practice, practice. Again, why is this important? It's very important for a lot of things that you guys are going to do for a living. Chiropractic school, physical therapy school, occupational therapy school, athletic training, physical education. Being able to see what's happening so that you can help people. Seeing where they may have limits in their motion. Maybe they're compensating for something. Maybe their shoulder can't move normally, so they compensate by bending their trunk to get their hand higher up in the air. So if you don't know these illusions, you may say, they have normal motion in their shoulder. Look, they can get their hands up 180 degrees. But that's because they're bending their trunk. They may be rotating their pelvis. So we need to be able to see. It's easy to see when it looks like it's moving, and it is. It's even easier to see when it's not moving. It looks like it's not, but it's not. So practicing those illusions. It looks like it is, but it's not. It looks like it's not, but it is. is going to make you much better clinicians, much better coaches, much better therapists. You guys are going to be teaching your classmates in graduate school this stuff. Okay? It's cool, very applicable for whatever you guys do for a living. My personal trainers especially. You know, being able to understand that when someone has pelvic tilt, that there has to be a trade-off. They can't just have pelvic tilt. Something has got to also be responsible for that tilt. I'll give you an example. If you put your arm in a sling, if you constantly put it in a flex position, and we don't sling anymore unless it's absolutely necessity, but that's because if you put your arm in a fetal position, it's going to be stiff. Why do you think you're stiff every morning? Because more than likely you were in a shortened position overnight, and your muscles are real stiff when you put them in shortened positions. So imagine someone who has anterior tilt. The illusion is, oh, the legs are still in their anatomical position. But if you move okay, so if you have anterior tilt, the illusion is, oh, no problem. Here's my hip. Here's my anterior tilt. Hey, look, my hip is still in its anatomical position. No, your hip is flexed. It's like walking around in a sling all day. So again, an illusion. It looks like nothing happened, but it did. And so if you have anterior tilt all day and those hips are in a sling, and then you driving in the car for a long time, your hips are flexed, you're sitting watching TV, your hips are flexed, you're playing video games, you're working on your computer, your hips. Think about how often your hips are in a sling, in a flex position. So it makes sense that when you finally stand up and they're super tight and you're trying to get your pelvis back to neutral, but these guys are super tight. So what are you going to do? You're just going to keep your pelvis tilted to keep it in a flex position. And the illusion is, oh, well, my hips are in anatomical. When the reality is your hips are so tight that it's literally pulling the pelvis forward. And then your trunk is going to have to recurve back to compensate to keep your balance and to keep your shoulders level. So these are the things that we're working towards seeing. Okay? These are the things. I hope everybody's doing well. Next class, we're going to be doing transverse plane stuff. That's super fun. Okay? We'll talk to you later.